Legacy of Hope commemorates the pivotal support extended to South Africa's freedom forces during the apartheid era by Russia, Cuba, and numerous other nations. In a world now navigating profound uncertainty and transformation, the echoes of this global solidarity resonate. The aspiration for a peaceful and prosperous future hinges upon international partnerships founded on historical lessons, mutual respect, and a commitment to a global community.
South Africa, particularly democratic South Africa, is inextricably linked to the global South and to a free and just world. Why do I say so? Because we attained our freedom and our democracy as a result of international solidarity. Many countries, many people of conscience across the world stood up against apartheid, applied international pressure, and hence we're able to have a democratic South Africa today.
During apartheid, I don't think there was a country or people that received so much international support, that gave our leaders protection, that gave our leaders support. And even if we talk about SADC, despite the attacks you saw in Lesotho, where Swin and others were killed, we saw Mozambique, where even the late Ruth First were killed, where Father Lapsley was bombed. We look at Botswana, that went through issues. Namibia also fighting, but at least Namibia got its independence in 1980.
The struggle of all those peoples of Southern Africa, as well as elsewhere in the world, from Cuba to Algeria to Vietnam, the post-Second World War struggles, coming on the heels of the great victory which was led by the Red Army, by the Soviet Union, which basically was largely responsible for the smashing of Hitler, fascism, Germany, and so on. That's very important to remind people of. The effect of the victory over fascism in the Second World War gave rise to the independence movements throughout the world for freedom. So the ANC and Communist Party were very strong and important in South Africa, had huge support on a class basis, led by the Communist Party, on national liberation basis against racism by the ANC, African National Congress. They did so well, they came to the point of so threatening the regime that huge terror was unleashed and they were banned, they were outlawed. There were the massacres, I referred to the one in 1960, Sharpeville. Once there was that repression, there was no other possibility of change in South Africa other than a recourse to arms. In the aftermath then of the Second World War, we saw huge changes taking place internationally, and particularly the collapse of the colonial system all over the world. Very quickly and readily, the Soviet Union agreed to provide military help, training in the Soviet Union, and weapons and so on.
In the 80s, and in fact long before, even in the 60s, the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, was one of those countries or blocks of countries like Cuba, like the African countries, that supported the apartheid struggle, the struggle against apartheid. The struggle that supported our fight for justice, for democracy. It's also those countries that supported the liberation of Mozambique, Angola, post-colonial times. So you can see the solidarity was amongst the progressive countries at the time. So it was almost natural for them to support us in our struggles as the Soviet Union as well. The Soviet Union supported us by housing some of our students in military studies, military training. They gave us weapons. They educated our economists. A lot of students resided in the Soviet Union for decades. We even had, the ANC had what was called special representatives. It's almost like ambassadors in this country, even though we were not a country yet. We were a liberation movement, but we were allowed to have a country presence in all the countries of the Soviet Union. And that helped us in a big way in our struggle. Without that, I think we would have taken longer. We wouldn't have gotten our democracy and freedom at the time and in the way that we got it.
They were the Palestinian people, not as a country, because they didn't have statehood. They still don't have statehood. But during the ongoing struggle for freedom, they supported us. The Algerians, whilst facing off against the French and after getting their independence, but still having to face off against French dominance, still supported us. So there are many. To mention one is not going to be fair. Since the 1979 revolution in Iran, one of the first things that the late Ayatollah Khomeini did was to immediately cut off ties with South Africa. But more importantly, Iranian oil was basically keeping the apartheid economy going to a great extent. That was cut off immediately. Various countries sacrificed for our freedom. Of course, there was Libya as well, under late Colonel Gaddafi. Whatever our critique of Gaddafi towards the end may have been, but the reality is he made his country vulnerable.
When the apartheid government bombed Zambia to hunt us down, they killed Zambians. When the South African government bombed people in Zimbabwe or in Botswana or in Lesotho, they were looking for our people, for the freedom fighters, but they were killing locals. So in that way, a lot of those countries sacrificed some of their countrymen, some of the countrywomen. But they wanted to do it because they supported our cause.
The call by President Oliver Tambo to make South Africa ungovernable and apartheid unworkable is what the youth of our country responded to. And many of them went and swelled the ranks of our glorious People's Army, Umkhonto weSizwe. And those that remained in the townships of our country continued to engage in skirmishes with one of Africa's most sophisticated military machines, using the most rudimentary weapons, your stones, your petrol bombs, and various other such weaponry. They were daring, they were brave, they were courageous. Many were killed, but they surged on in their quest for freedom.
Oliver Tambo made a call in the 80s that South Africa must become ungovernable. That was a very important moment because as that moment happened, we saw the advancing of a process in Russia or the old Soviet where we've seen a complete reform taking shape in 1988, the perestroika process. Even whilst that took place, you had in Angola the Battle of Cuanavale, where the Cubans were really protective of the people of Angola in partnership with the revolutionaries of the African National Congress and others. So it was a melting pot. It was a melting pot period. The Russian community, the Soviet community was committed and patriotic to their cause, but equally to make sure that the South African cause and the Angolan cause are being protected.
When the Sharpeville massacre took place, which was in 1960, I felt I had to do something, and I went in search of what was the underground Communist Party and the ANC, which had just been banned. I was lucky that a relative of mine was a communist, and that gave me the entree. I got very involved, including in the formation of the military wing of those two organizations. The police were hot on my heels, and I was sent out the country, basically for military training in the then Soviet Union. I was part of a first grouping that went to the Soviet Union. Very, very exciting period. And the Soviets were absolutely full square behind us, gave fantastic, unstinting support. And of course, the center of this was Moscow and Russia itself.
So a whole generation of ANC students kind of grew up studying the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had built a university called Patrice Lumumba, dedicated to training African, Latin American, Asian students in the 60s. They show the principles of solidarity, which I think that's why many people look fondly on the former Soviet Union. But it wasn't just Russia, there was 15 Soviet republics. So we had a lot of MK students training in Ukraine, a lot of people studying in Moscow. People who were in the Navy went to Azerbaijan, people who went for the Air Force training went to Kyrgyzstan. So it was across the Soviet Union. So it was something that was late 80s. It was cold during winter. You'll see sun for maybe 3-4 hours during winter. minus 10, 20 degrees. Summers are the opposite, where you'd have sun for 20 hours in a day because it's so far north. But things were incredibly cheap. Quality of goods are not always great, not many diverse goods. But nobody was starving, nobody was living on the streets. Everybody had accommodation, people could go and study. There was a lot of ANC students there at many different institutes, universities, academies, military academies. There was an ANC office there which had the status of an embassy to support the ANC students and to be a link with the Soviet government. And people from all across, all walks of life in South Africa, people from Mitchell's Plain, from Guguletu, from the Eastern Cape, studying different things. And you would learn about each other's experiences, you learn about all parts of South African life. And nobody was sticking with all the apartheid nonsense. People were focused on a non-racial democratic South Africa. Maybe the most famous one is Thabo Mbeki. He had studied military science in the Soviet Union in the mid-60s. Many of the other ministers, people like Ronnie Castles, Joe Slovo, had trained in Ukraine. But you also have people who are less high profile, like if I look at the current chiefs of the Defense Force, all of them are studying the Soviet Union. And to see that, the first black chiefs of the Navy studied in Azerbaijan, had made a success of themselves. And people who came from very poor communities, very poor lives, have achieved the pinnacle of success. Tight bonds, and one can see people made really positive contributions. So that investment by the Soviet Union wasn't lost. It was, laid the foundation for very close relations between Russia and South Africa today.
Those of us that were trained by the CPSU, which is the communist part of the Soviet Union, they were able to give us the necessary theoretical tools that enabled us to understand how to conduct the revolution. And this is what the Marxist-Leninist theory gives you, what some now refer to as tools of analysis. So many of our leaders were trained by the party of Lenin. And this is why perhaps we think the way we do, because we've been trained to look at issues in a much more scientific manner.
To understand the struggle against the apartheid regimes and its allies, one must turn to the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale in Angola. It was not a big battle in global terms, but it was a battlefield on which the full power, intent and determination of Russia, Cuba and the other partners of the Freedom Forces were demonstrated to the South African Defence Force and UNITA. As such, the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale will be remembered as the final turning point towards the liberation of South Africa. It is important to note that perestroika took place during 1988, the same time that the freedom struggle in South Africa reached this turning point. And in spite of the challenges within Russia, the Soviet Union kept its promises and gave support to achieve the turning point.
The late 50s and early 60s were the time for us for hope, because Africa was being decolonized, and we were living for this period. Ghana had become independent in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961. Zambia only became independent in 1964, and then Botswana in 1966. But we were all living with this hope that we were going to get our freedom.
America was one of the countries against our fight for justice, just by the way, in the 80s and the 60s. So they supported the apartheid government. Where Russia, China, and our African brothers supported us for our struggle for justice, America and the UK supported the apartheid government against us. So we didn't like them because they were our enemies ideologically and politically. Only eventually they came around and started applying sanctions, the US and the UK. But in the beginning, they didn't support us. They supported the apartheid government.
The apartheid regime had huge resources and the support of the Western former colonial countries, and especially the USA, and they supported counter-revolutionary bandit groups. In Angola, the key one was UNITA under Jonas Savimbi, and they had their bases on the border with the then Southwest Africa, that's Namibia, where the South African army was in occupation of that country. So they could give huge support in training and in weapons of war to UNITA. So UNITA were able to mount a very dangerous and sustained military drive, counter-revolutionary drive against the government of Angola.
The apartheid regime would not think twice about crossing the border and killing innocent nationals in the countries where members of the ANC, members of Umkhonto were members of the SACP, members of SACTU were based. And Angola particularly was outstanding because from their independence, the apartheid regime, with its puppets of UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, did not allow the growth and development of Angola. And that's why, to us, Angola was the firm trench of our revolution.
The liberation of Angola and Mozambique gave the movements who were still struggling, so Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, added support, because across the borders in Southern Africa, we had bases now, strong bases, in which the socialist countries, China, the Soviet Union, and East Germany, GDR, Angola, particularly Cuba and the Soviet Union, were helping those countries. And the strength of the liberation struggle, the armed struggle, was that people within those countries, like in South Africa, were greatly inspired. So mass uprisings began to take place in those countries, with more young people coming out to join our ranks. The Soviet Union provided Angola with advisors for their military, as did Cuba. So in our camps in Angola, we had Soviet officers as well as Cubans helping us train our people. The ANC, our forces, joined there with the Angolans to protect the Angolan revolution. But the South Africans invaded. That's when the Cubans came in with Soviet weapons and assistance and drove the South Africans back into Namibia. And by 1987, there was a fierce onslaught by the Angolans with advice and support from the Soviet advisors and with their equipment on the UNITA strongholds in the south. And they were defeating UNITA. And that's when, towards the end, October 1987, the South Africans came in great force with very advanced weaponry. The situation was very critical, very dire. The Soviets were giving huge support with equipment. The Cubans were on the ground, 20,000 of them. And together with the Angolan forces and the Namibian forces, they unleashed a huge offensive in March. And that's the Battle of Cuito, Cuanavale.
The biggest light, the brightest light of the planet shines in Cuba. And that is because the majority of the planet would not have found the instruments to liberate itself had it not been for the Cuban people. The Cuban people give us the greatest sense of sacrificing everything, expecting nothing in return. When the Cuban people left Angola, they only left with their fallen compatriots. They didn't leave with Angola's gold, its oil, its diamonds. When Cuba went to Ethiopia, Cuba didn't take Ethiopia's mineral resources. Cuba's the kind of society, I think, that helps.
We have a very passionate feel about what Cuba did. It's a very, very small country, had its own problems, had a blockade, still has a blockade from the US against them. In spite of all of that, they provided support all over the world. In Angola, in Mozambique. In our case, they gave us military training. In our case, they flew MiG planes in Cuito, Cuanavale in Angola, helping us.
One of the things I've heard from the soldiers that were there, the soldiers that come from our hands that were there, they said, you know, the Cubans flew treetop with their MiGs in the war, so they could not be detected.
They gave us weapons and training and military strategy. But in addition to that, that country is one of the best countries in the world in terms of their medical system, medical health systems. Cuba provides their doctors to refugee camps, to countries that don't have enough doctors. So even in the medical sphere, they provide healthcare and healthcare support to other countries, even though they are a small and poor country that is under a blockade of their own. And in spite of that, they still supported us. In Angola, you had Cubans stationed there to protect Angola against the apartheid government that was attacking Angola. They didn't have to come to Angola or Mozambique. They flew the planes at Cuito, Cuanavale. We lost a lot of people, Angolans and South Africans, in that battle. But thanks to the Cubans, the SADF, the white government of then, could not invade Angola and had to withdraw. So we hold Cuba highly, dearly. You know, it's where you sacrifice even though you have little. You know, you give more to others because they need more than what you have.
Look, I think it was a turning point in the liberation struggle. For so long, the apartheid regime was able to get away with murder in the neighboring states. It was able to raid Lesotho, Mozambique, or Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on. It invaded Angola twice when Angola became independent because it supported the ANC and SWAPO of Namibia. It invaded Angola again in the 80s. It reached the outskirts of the capital. And Angola was able to push back to defend itself against the South African Defence Force, against UNITA, which was basically the apartheid regime's allies. And Angola was able, with very few resources, but with the support of the Cuban military, But that battle marked a turning point where the apartheid regime agreed it had to withdraw from Angola. It set the path for negotiations for an independent, democratic, non-racial Namibia. It then kind of helped to cascade into South Africa's own democratic negotiations and ultimately a democratic breakthrough in '94.
Wow, you know, some of us never even slept a night before because first and foremost, we didn't have cars to receive Madiba. It was the cars of the members of the Western Cape Traders Association that were driving that day, that were organized by Mr. Daoud Khan, may his soul so rest in peace, who was the chairman of the Western Cape Traders Association at that time. So we didn't sleep a night before that day. So we had to make sure that we're prepared because we knew that we must expect the unexpected because people heard that Mandela was coming out that day. And people began walking as early as 5:00 a.m. Walking to Paarl from all corners of the Western Cape. So you can imagine what kind of a day it was. We were privileged as the people of the Western Cape, people of Cape Town, to witness firsthand, face to face, that history that was made on the day of the release of Nelson Mandela from Victor Verster prison.
Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've seen a change in the balance of forces in the world. The West were cock-a-hoop because they thought they could bully Russia. They pushed NATO, which actually after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, there shouldn't have been a continuation of NATO. We saw under Gorbachev, unfortunately, and Yeltsin, the Soviet Union weakening, but the West have always seen Russia, its resources and its territory as something they aspired to. It wasn't only Adolf Hitler. We saw them entering Eastern Europe after having promised that NATO would not advance from Germany when the East German government had fallen.
From a South African point of view, the Ukraine conflict creates problems of its own. The United States and the NATO countries are demanding that we align ourselves with them as allies, and that we therefore turn our back on Russia. Their demand compromises the historic relations and loyalties between Russia and South Africa. But our reasons for resisting the demands of the West is not only based on relationships, it is ideological and based on observance of the West's continued attempts to create a unipolar geopolitical world.
So we have kept relations with the Russians at political level with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and we have been monitoring the developments in that region, especially Russia's repulsion of imperialist expansions, European imperialism through the proxy of Ukraine, trying to encroach into Russian territory and rebuilding and remodeling the borders in the Far East.
So when the Soviet Union broke down, Ukraine went independent and became their own country. And so did Czechoslovakia and a lot of the other countries, Slovenia, Estonia, and so on. But a lot of those countries turned against Russia. There's nothing wrong with you becoming an independent country, but you turned against the country of which you were a brother yesterday. What has happened is that Ukraine a brother of Russia of before, has now become a tool in the hands of the West to challenge Russia.
The talks that took place between European powers and Russia, particularly at the time the Soviet Union, towards its dissolution as the Soviet Union, which also guaranteed no inch expansion eastward of the borders that they agreed that defines the Russian Federation today. And Europe literally undermined that.
In 2014 and 2015 agreements with President Putin, who now was growing in confidence and power, and it's come out how the West had lied to him and to Russia, and that they were intent on building the Ukraine into a force against Russia, and they found the kind of collaborators they were looking for, especially Zelensky.
We are recognizing a man that has created his country a meat grinder, sending young men into the front line for something that could have been avoided. He has lost legitimacy both in Ukraine and in world affairs. He's losing the war. He has messed up big time, destroyed wealth and value in society. For the US government, for instance, alone to have spent almost 350 billion, some even estimate could have reached to 500 billion if considering other forms of support. A man so destructive of wealth of society and particularly of life.
It could have been resolved. Didn't need to have a war. That war is a result of NATO with the US and Western Europe using Zelensky and the Ukraine as proxy force. Russia and China, together with the global South, have a cooperative approach. If the West refused to support Zelensky, give him the weapons he needed, his regime would collapse tomorrow.
The role of the Russian Federation, especially President Putin, has been very important in redefining the new world order. And we think this response has shaken Europe a bit, and the response also by the new president in America has also shaken further Europe to rethink their strategy of just annexation, undermining everyone and doing as they please. So the special military operation is an important intervention in our case for sovereignty of state, respect for international law. Of course, given the response of Europe, it has come at a huge cost because it was clear all of Western Europe or Western imperialism had ganged against the Russian Federation. But so far, so good. Russia has sustained the battle, sustained its integrity, has not been defeated.
What we are seeing currently taking shape in Ukraine, we must recall that there was a coup d'etat in 2014. There was a legitimate government that was overthrown with the help of the West. That's the first thing. Secondly, we saw an encroachment of NATO forces and weapons being put on the border of Russia. So that's the second thing that we've experienced there. And thirdly, we saw a narrative playing it out, and it made it untenable for the Russian community, for President Putin, not to act. So what we are seeing there is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine that played out, but essentially the scene was set by the West, and in particular the NATO forces, to do an encroachment. It's very important to recognize that this is also taking place closer in home. We are concerned that in Botswana there's a military camp of the US, and if you have an encroachment too close to your sovereignty, to your independence, and you've got mighty forces of global powers, military forces, they can easily try and compromise the independence of a nation state.
The dominance of the West, the dominance of this bipolar world, or this monopolar world where America and Europe dominated the media, the culture, the heritage, slowly but surely changing. And you see voices from India, voices from China, assertive voices from Russia, from South. The global South is also now making the voices heard.
For me, there's two reasons why BRICS is important. The one is America and the West have become bullies. They've seen themselves as the only policemen and want to dictate to everyone. They've also become strong economically and militarily, so they can dictate. But America has systems. They actually have their own rules on how to do it. In the past, they had to use those systems to make the decisions to rule, to oppress, to dictate to others. Trump is a different person to the previous presidents of the Americans. He doesn't even want to use the rules that America has, the laws and so on. Secondly, he's a businessman, right? So everything for him is a business, is a transaction. Everything. What can the country and himself, or those close to him, make out of it financially, business-wise, right? So his politics is guided by his business. Normally your politics is guided by your rules, by your principles, by your sense of justice, by democracy, you see? And that's how and why you do things. Trump is now saying he is going to punish us, he's going to take that away. Why? Because some of our policies, some of our laws, they don't like.
This is not the first time he has made remarks about South Africa and transformation. I don't think it should be taken lightly. I do firstly think that it's talking absolute nonsense and it's preposterous. Because even if you look at the expropriation of land, at the act that was signed, it's not a radical legislation. Many wanted constitutional amendment. We didn't go the route of constitutional amendment. Here it's about the discourse and the propaganda that has been put out there. And Trump articulates and expresses in a very crass manner what Americans think of us in Africa. Anything which speaks to transformation, anything which speaks to getting back what is rightfully ours as the majority of South Africans is rubbished and is viewed as an attack on white people.
It's not your house. This is my house, my country or our country. We decide what we must do here. You decide what you must do in your house, in your country. Trump is now trying to say to us, in our house, what we are doing here, he doesn't like, and therefore he's going to punish us.
This is maybe an opportunity to say, you know what, while the American economy is important, we don't want to cut off ties with America, let's start openly getting ourselves into other markets and not being so reliant on the Americans.
From a historical point of view, it's so important that we capitalize and pick up on those old historical ties, but also the new order that's unfolding around us. That we, at the level of the economy, at the level of energy, at the level of education, that we just strengthen those ties. And instead of looking west only, let's look north and east. And Africans' solidarity is so important. Because remember, all these boundaries you're talking about of South Africa are all just constructs and imaginations of the Western world. So let's use our relationship in this BRICS configuration to break down those boundaries.
We can be in BRICS and work with America. We can be in BRICS and work with the European Union. There are economic benefits. The economies of some of those countries, India, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, are very, very big economies. Any country that wants to trade, that wants to grow, needs to partner with countries that have got big economies. That is another benefit for us, being part of a group of countries where we can trade and share things, where to the benefit of both of us.
Yeah.
We see today how fed up people everywhere in the world are with the American hegemony and that of the NATO and the EU, from Britain to Germany and France. So we've seen, particularly in West Africa, in the Sahel, how there's been an upsurge led by the military to get the colonial powers out, especially the French, and raise the red flag of the flag of the Soviet Union, but also flags of the Russian Federation. And when Russian commentators come to South Africa and interview me, many of them come through Africa. And they say to me, what do I think about these young people in places like Senegal, like the Congo, like Central African Republic? They're amazed when they're there to come across young people holding the Russian flag aloft and the Soviet flag. And I laugh and I say it's very simple. It's because they've long come to see the former colonial powers in the USA as their exploiters of their wealth, as their oppressors, supporting backward regimes in power in their countries. And they see that Russia, as people in South Africa do, carrying on the legacy of the Soviet Union, which came to support oppressed people throughout the world.